I'm Jeff Brenneman. I'm the Vice President for Government Relations. We're really excited to have as one of our fall Week Talk series navigating the thin line. Free expression in higher education. And with us today is our one and only General Counsel, Keith Hahn, which we appreciate, and two special guests that have joined us from FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Is that right? All right, good. I wanted to make sure I got it right. We're really excited to have them here on campus. They do great work to defend free speech around the country on campuses. Sometimes they're a thorn in our side, and that's their job, is to be making sure that they're defending free speech on every campus. So we're glad they're here for us to have our free speech rights and have an interaction with them about these topics. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe Cohn, who is the Legislative and Policy Director, and Lindsay Rank, who does their Student Press Council and Engagement with students. They've already had lunch with our students at the new Student Center and taped a podcast with Wider and a morning open classroom. So we've been keeping them busy today. Thanks, and again, welcome to campus.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for the kind introduction and for all of the work that went into hosting us today. We really appreciate it. So I'm Joe Cohn, I'm our Legislative and Policy Director, and that is a fancy way of saying that I do FIRE's government relations, which is a more technical way of saying that I'm our beggar, I'm our groveler, I'm our tap dancer. And we're going to talk about a little bit separate things in prepared remarks, which are sparse. We're going to try to have them pretty short so we have more dialogue and discussion. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the cultural aspects of free speech that we need to think about, at institutions of higher education, and Lindsay is going to talk a little bit more about the actual policy, work, because you're governed by actual sets of policies that set rules. The reason why we do what we do at FIRE, and for the first 20 plus years of our history, we were exclusively a higher ed civil liberties group fighting for free speech, due process, religious liberty, student press rights of students and faculty at institutions of higher education, to our transition roughly a year ago into adding free speech advocacy for all of society as a whole, is because institutions of higher education are particularly crucial in establishing the good habits, or frankly the bad habits, of a free society. It's here where we're expected to parse and look at the most difficult conversations, the most difficult issues, solve the hardest problems. And it's in these kind of laboratories where students are supposed to be thinking about these things and debating it, where we're training the next generation of leaders of industry, leaders of government, heads of households, the whole nine. So that's why it's so crucial to get it right. But you're not islands. You're dealing with a world in which there are broader cultural influences, and you may have noticed that we're in an era that's particularly polarized. And that's not to say there's ever been a golden era where everyone agreed and that we had this golden age of free speech and political unity. But those of us who have been around for a while get a sense that it's a little bit different now than it's been in the past. And it's particularly heightened in unique and different ways. And on college campuses, we started seeing it in 2014 with a huge spike in what we coined the phrase disinvitations, revoking invitations to speakers to speak on campus. And we have campaigns to get speakers disinvited on all parts of the political spectrum. Condoleezza Rice, Madeleine Albright, both subjected to disinvitation campaigns. Bill Maher, Mike Pence, and even the Dalai Lama. So it affects all of us. We have shout downs of people who are speakers and confrontations with street preachers on campus. And I know that your campus has Sister Cindy. But that's an issue as well in terms of the debate of, are people entitled to a platform? Should they be given a platform? Or if you disagree with them, can you chase them off of campus? And we've seen some of those campaigns turn actually violent, and sometimes it's just a proper counter speech. But there are also campaigns to get people expelled from school for having said something, either contemporaneously or even 7 years earlier when they were a teenager on Instagram or TikTok feed, or campaigns to get a faculty member fired because they said something controversial. I won't go into that one in further depth here, but the point being that these cultural things are real, and part of the discussion today, I hope, is going to be about what we can do as communities to start reversing that tide. Now, how do we develop the better skills of listening and the better hygiene of listening and speaking in ways that help us see through these problems rather than deeper into the divides that we have. And so with that, I just want to thank you again for having me here and turn it over to my colleague, Lindsay, to talk a little bit about the legalistic aspects of this.
Sure. I'm Lindsay Rank. I'm FIRE's Student Press Council, so I run our Student Press Freedom Initiative, which is an initiative that's all about defending and supporting the expressive freedoms of student journalists specifically. I'm not necessarily going to talk about student journalism right this second, although I think that's probably part of the conversation. But I am, like Joe said, going to really focus on some of the broader policies on expressive freedoms on campus that can affect this culture. And I think that's a really important note, that these are two different siloed topics. The idea of culture of free speech on campus, or even in our society at large, is not a wholly separate issue from the policies that exist on our campuses, or the policies and laws that exist at a place of employment, or on Facebook, or the laws that exist in our statutes. These are inextricably tied to one another, because when we have policies that have certain restrictions, that trickles down into how we feel the culture in our environment, right? So there's a few types of policies that we really focus on at FIRE. One that is probably thought of as like our bread and butter, most famous, is speech zones. So speech zones are something that was really popular in the 1960s and 70s, but really continued on and saw a resurgence in the 2010s into today. We just had a speech zone case in March, and these speech zones are essentially a place where the university says, you can, in this 100 square foot area, express yourself. You can have your right to free speech there, but nowhere else on campus, just in this 100 square foot area. And sometimes they're a really small percentage of campus. I say 100 square foot a little facetiously, but that's not totally inaccurate in a lot of these cases. And the case that we had just in March was at the University of Denver. There was Ilya Shapiro was coming to campus. He's a conservative academic. And some more progressive students wanted to protest that, and the university, the law school actually told them, okay, you can come protest, but you can only protest in these two places. And that's a speech zone, right? So that's one type of policy that we see that really restricts the ability of students and faculty to engage in their expressive freedoms on campus. Another big one is security fees. This is sort of backdoor way that universities sometimes prevent more controversial speakers from coming to campus. And the way this plays out is there's an example that just happened at University of New Mexico in April, where the Students for Life were trying to bring a speaker to campus. And the university, I think, knows we can't just tell you can't bring your speaker to campus because we don't like the message. So instead, we're going to say, we're really worried about protesters. And so we need you to hire security to the tune of $8,000 that you as students definitely have. Most students don't have $8,000, right? And so the students in that case had a really hard time bringing their speaker to campus because they couldn't afford this onerous security fee that the university was imposing. And you'll see policies like that on institutional campuses nationwide. But you see all kinds of other policies, protest policies, right, that say you need to give us 2 weeks notice before you can protest. Well, when George Floyd gets killed and you want to protest the next day, you didn't know 2 weeks ago that George Floyd was going to be killed. You couldn't give the university that notice. So that, again, is another one of those policies that really prevents expressive freedoms. I'll circle back to this one, but subjective rules about who gets funding. So your student government, which gets, I'm sure, money from the institution to dole out usually to student organizations. And if they have rules that say, well, this committee is going to decide based on whether they like you or not, whether you get funding, that's not great. And we've seen that. There's a case that I'm thinking of at Truman State University where the Animal Rights Club was not recognized, did not receive funding from the student government there because animal rights might be uncomfortable for other students, I think was the language that was used, to see, animals being abused. And then there's things like posting policies that also might have subjective requirements. So if you're a student group and you want to post a poster about your campus event that you're having, or if you want to post a poster up about a political concern you have, and kind of those same ideas that if there's not objective requirements for when you can and can't, or where you can and can't post those subjective requirements can be abused. And the last kind of policy that I'm going to get to, and this is only because it, I think, feeds into some of the conversation we can have about WMU, is policies that threaten to punish students for sort of these like subjective categories of speech, like annoying speech or profane speech. And the reason, I don't mean to call out WMU here, but this is one way that I think we could improve, because we just had a conversation about this, but the computer use policy here does ban profane and insensitive content, which those are really kind of subjective terms. What is insensitive? What does it mean to be profane? Does that mean I can't, email my buddy with the F word in my email? So those types of policies are also some that we see that that really restrict the freedom of expression on campus.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keith Hahn. I'm the general counsel here at Western. I've been on this campus for a little bit over 1 year. Prior to that, I was at Oakland University for 14 years, doing roughly the same things in a diminished role a little bit. I'm also in charge of FOIA. I'm in charge of risk management, internal audit, chair of the policy committee, and the compliance committee. So in some ways, I am the legislator, the executive officer, and the judge for a lot of these issues that we're talking about today. So I'm really glad that we've had some people here today to discuss our free speech here on campus. My first free speech experience was when I was in seventh grade, I believe. And I remember there was sort of a movement amongst the teachers that if we did not say the Pledge of Allegiance, we would be disciplined. That's something you probably would not hear of today, but again, this was a long time ago in the late 70s. And I didn't have, a lot of concept of free speech at that time, but something about that always rubbed me wrong. How can you tell me to say or not say something from my teachers? I didn't have that developed sense of trying to protect atheists who don't believe in God, or the fact that you don't have to pledge allegiance to the flag to be an American. But that always stuck with me. Obviously, to this day, I still remember it. I've landed on the University of Michigan campus in the late 80s, and one of the first things I noticed were these shanties all along the Diag, and they were protesting apartheid in South Africa. That sort of progressed to a movement on campus, no guns, no cops, no code. At the time, the University of Michigan was trying to institute a code of conduct for students, as well as having a deputized police force. And all those were issues that were sort of bubbling up at the time. So, at the same time, you had Hash Bash on the Diag, and you had Preacher Mike, which I guess was a predecessor of Sister Cindy, basically doing the same thing, and even Shaky Jake, who probably some of you older might know of. So, free speech issues have always been sort of the forefront of my mind. It's part of the reason why I went to college, or to law school rather. At one point during my undergraduate education, I told a friend that the Constitution is the single most important document in world history. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. To me, at the time it was. I'm sure people with religious texts might differ from that, but to me it was very important. It still is very important. And I've landed in this position, and I get the opportunity to try to do the right thing and follow the law, and that's what I want to do. We've pledged to do, and we've actually had some good conversations already today to try to make sure that these policies that we're talking about are in compliance with the law. Because that's ultimately what we want, is to have those in compliance. Now, there's always, in my job also, when I talk about sort of being the judge, there's always competing factors, right? I go back to the old adage, sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt me, or whatever the rhyme was. That's not true. Words do hurt. They can hurt a lot more than sticks and stones at times. And we're always confronted with those issues here on a college campus. Just the last Wednesday or Thursday when Sister Cindy was here, I was going to read portions of an email that the university received. I'm not going to identify the person that sent it, but that's not necessary. In referring to Sister Cindy, this writer states, she draws in a very large crowd of those who just want to laugh at her and those who fully believe in what she is saying. That's really what we're trying to do here. We're trying to let people express their opinions, no matter what their opinions are. But at the end of the email, this person states, for a college campus that strives to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, I would hope to see something done about this to protect certain marginalized groups on campus. So we always get pushback when there are speakers of whatever type on campus that we have to deal with. And a lot of that, as we were talking about, reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, we always have to be careful, are what we're trying to do to regulate some of these activities on campus, do they go too far? Do they silence speakers? And obviously sort of the first thing that a speaker might see are those policies. I don't know what the percentage of students on campus that read the policies are, but those that are interested in it, they might see these policies and they will see some of that language and feel that they are threatened, they cannot express themselves. So I've stated to my colleagues here today that we will work on those policies and try to get them to the green light stage as soon as we can.
Thanks, Keith. If I could just give a little bit of context for something here for a moment. FIRE, one of the things that we do as part of our kind of mission to promote free speech, but also to have information out there that people can use as they make decisions, is that we review policies, the written policies of institutions of higher education across the country, a sampling of them, and annually report on them. And and we give individual policies one at a time a rating of green, red, yellow, and then warning is a different category, and I'll touch on that really briefly. But a green light policy is a policy that complies exactly with what the case law says. So it poses no free speech threat. A red light policy is one that very clearly contradicts established existing case law. And then a yellow light policy is one that gives discretion to administrators they could either use properly or abuse. So if you're a student or a faculty member, you can't turn to the policy to protect you from being harmed if they use poor discretion. But it also doesn't impose the rule that says that you will be harmed. So those are like the three main ratings. Warnings are for schools that are private, either religiously based or with a particular ethos, and you see that on the left with schools like Vassar or Bard, but more commonly think through religious institutions like Bob Jones and Liberty, BYU, that declare that they're trying to create a community behind a particular set of values, and they have the right to under the First Amendment. So it isn't a violation of the First Amendment to have free speech problems there, but we want to warn the public, so if you choose to go to a school like that, you want you to have the accurate information, you will have fewer free speech rights. So that's our category, and that's what Keith kind of ended with. We are really very optimistic about working together with Keith and his colleagues, to look at the policies here, because there's room for improvement, but you know what? The right people are looking at it. So we're really kind of excited about that prospect. A good portion of the discussion, though, today is going to be about what the rest of the community can do. You feel like droplets in the ocean, the wave of the tides of the pressures around on these issues. It's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed, but all of us can do things that will make the climate better for open discussions and better for disagreement. And that's what I'm going to go to next, but not before I let others speak. So
Yeah, the only thing that I really want to add to what Keith was saying is, I recognize that it can be a thin line and it's complicated, and sometimes there are values that feel like they're in competition. All the time we see institutions struggling with how to walk that line between promoting diversity and anti-discrimination on campus and promoting a culture of free expression. And I think that, not to come in here and act like I have all of the solutions for you, because I don't, but I do want to challenge us to think about those types of values not necessarily as in competition, maybe in tension, but not in direct competition with each other. Are there things that we can do to help and support marginalized students on campus, for example, that don't involve censorship? Can we, for example, support students who may who may feel, for lack of a better word, triggered or uncomfortable when they see Sister Cindy on campus without shutting Sister Cindy down? Are there other options? And I would say that sometimes censorship seems like the easiest, fastest option to address some of those other issues that you might see on campus. But I don't necessarily think it's the best option a lot of the time. It doesn't necessarily get to the root of the problem. Kicking Sister Cindy off campus or kicking a student off campus who might have similar views doesn't change that person's mind and doesn't do anything to actually further, our collective values in our society. And instead, I would just challenge this community, and that this includes everyone who's here listening. Like, what else can you do other than silencing those who you disagree with to further some of those other values that might feel like they're in tension with expression?
Well,
One thing you could do is have a We Talk series, which we're trying to do. I think that's, I have had an opportunity once or twice here on campus to address student groups that sort of have that same concern of the email that I stated, and I try to do it in a non-legal way, but a lot of times it probably comes out in a very legalistic way, trying to explain to them the rights of people to have their own opinions. And one of the biggest tension points is offensive, hateful speech, and that's one that keeps coming up over and over again. It's, we know as lawyers, hateful speech is protected by the First Amendment, but again, there's sort of that. If I open about Sticks and Stones, I mean, that's a lot of people can be offended, and they want protection from the university or from the professor or from their supervisor. What sort of recommendations do you have for addressing these type of students or staff or faculty?
Yeah, I think that's a great framing and a good way to ask the question. It isn't just a legalistic answer. The truth of the matter, as you pointed out, is that the First Amendment doesn't allow for the punishment, but it's not allowing for the punishment or censorship of speech just for the fun of making sure that speech flourishes. It's because what is hateful is so fluid and so subjective that putting folks with authority to decide what speech is allowed and what speech is just too, mean, for lack of better terms, to be in the environment. I mean, picture the politician who you respect the least. I want everyone to spend 5 minutes thinking about who the worst politician of the last 20 years is for them, who they distrust the most. And then say that person gets to decide what speech is too hateful to be out there. Do you think that all of our lists would be identical? And do we think that those politicians would signal out the same speech? They really wouldn't. And and that's why we can't just do it in that particular way. In the United States, discrimination is unlawful, but bigotry itself is not. And part of it is because you can't punish people out of being bigots. Prejudice is defeated through education, through dialogue, discussion. And the great news is that at institutions of higher education, you have so many opportunities to forge connections and friendships and partnerships before there's a particular controversy, finding out what people have in common. That it's really hard to hate people you actually know. It's a lot easier to scapegoat people who you've never interacted with. And that's not to say that some of the others' views aren't, dumb as fudge. But you can think that as much as you want, but still see that there's some value in who they are. And there's value in knowing who holds these views and how many people hold these views so that you know how big the problem is. Because when you signal that if you step out of line, you're just going to be punished, people don't change their minds. They just change who they talk to about those opinions. They start sharing those views only with people they're confident agree with them. And then those views get reinforced and they get entrenched. And that's the echo chambers that we're most concerned about. And that's why American law, as unique as it is in the world, is signaling this. Because I agree with Keith entirely that sticks and stones may break the is not really a thoughtful way to think it through. Words are powerful, but that's also why we protect them. Because we can't have change without it. And every movement in history, civil rights movement, LGBT rights, women's suffrage, they all were successful because people were able to argue and fight for their points of view. They couldn't have been successful without that right. So we shouldn't be empowering those above us to decide what's allowed in and what's allowed out. The consequences are too high.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, of course, with everything that Joe says, as I almost always do. But I also think there's an element to this that we need to recognize as free speech advocates, that this is hard work. Living in a world and living in a society like the one that we're describing, where we listen to each other and we engage with people who disagree with us, that is inherently uncomfortable. And it can be hurtful. I mean, you're right. This adage, sticks and stones, isn't really accurate, isn't really thoughtful. But it's a matter of using a little bit more creativity than censorship requires to think about other ways to address that. And one that we really advocate for is more speech, right? If you encounter speech on campus that is racist, for example, and you really don't like that message, what can you do? Can you start your own protest? Can you join a Black Lives Matter group and protest with them? Can you write a letter to the editor to the Western Herald talking about, inclusion on campus and what we can do for inclusion? What are the other things, what are the other ways that you can speak up for what you believe in and be the louder voice on campus? But also, I think thinking of ways outside of speech is part of it too. What self-care options can we give to students to decompress after having these difficult conversations? And what educational opportunities can we give to students and faculty and other constituents to learn how to get through the discomfort that is inherent in these conversations?
One of the dynamic challenges that we're all facing is that, as I said in my preview and teased in the earlier remarks, is that we're not on an island. Society as a whole has all of these issues. And one of the things that we've been talking about in themes throughout the day is self-censorship. Like, why are people walking on eggshells? What's contributing to it? How can we ease that? And I think that almost everyone feels that they are, and almost everyone feels to some extent a little bit helpless, about dealing with it. But I don't think this is a irretractable problem. For one, I don't think that you're going to change every person's mind, and I don't think that anyone has an obligation, to confront and argue with every street preacher or adversary, whomever. But you have the right to if you want. You can engage them if you choose. But my advice to folks who are listening in the community is find people, the smartest people who you disagree with. Find them, get their perspectives, develop and forge friendships there, and that will help kind of develop a little bit of the better skills that Lindsay talks about in terms of better free speech skills, because listening is one of the major aspects of free speech skills. The other thing that we're seeing in some of the data is that there's not just the polarization of our adversaries that has us concerned. Really, actually, the bigger aspect of self-censorship is the enforcement within our own side for people who aren't pure of mind and stepping out of line of, of our own side. Like you see that, on both sides of the political spectrum. Don't cross the MAGA group. Or on the left, that there's only one view that's tolerable on X, Y, or Z, issue. And, people are walking on a lot of eggshells because they're afraid of crossing their own peer group. So what I would recommend is not, we're never gonna live in a world where people don't say obnoxious things, or people don't slip up, or we don't come up with new videos of them when they were 12 years old saying something horrible, or even last week saying something horrible. But what we can do is think each one of those instances through the lens of, how would I handle this if it was my best friend who just had this exact same snafu? You might not just choose to let it slide, you might still engage it, but you probably wouldn't go into destroy mode. So it's developing those habits up front before there's a particular controversy and a particular conflict that you want to view it through the lens of, where you're talking about conceptually with the community of why we want to establish grace for each other. That's not a judgment-free zone of never being able to say you're wrong, or why do you disagree, or why your point of view shouldn't be how the world is run. But it is about trying to, each one of us, be a leader in speaking out. When you see the mob going after someone, not only don't contribute to that mob, but maybe actively defend them. Because you know what? A lot of people let that person defend themselves on their own, when these things happen. And that's the big thing that we can all do. We can all do that a little bit better.
So a lot of the concepts we've been talking about so far seem to be, the Sister Cindy type situation. Let's go to the classroom. Looking at the survey results, there were a lot of comments about not feeling the ability to say what they wanted to in the class concept, and obviously you have the intersection of free speech and academic freedom at once, and it's one of the most contested friction points I think we have. What are some of your some advice as to how we as an institution can deal with the classroom, where it's not necessarily a public event, we're not in there all the time, we being administration, we're not in there all the time, right. To ensure that students feel like they can speak their minds.
I think I'm going to say this word a lot during today's events, but education. We're in an educational institution, and I think that is one really key part of this, is teaching students, first of all, that they're not going to face retribution for disagreeing with their professors. And part of that is teaching faculty how to teach students that they're not going to face that retribution. So are there ways that we can support faculty? Because I honestly believe most professors are not out to get their students. They're not there saying, oh gosh, who in here is conservative? I want to make sure that they're at the bottom of the class, or vice versa, right? They're there to educate you. They're here because they want to teach the next generation. And so empowering professors to say to their students, we're going to have hard conversations in this class, and I want you to feel free to disagree with me or disagree with your peers, and that's not going to have negative results for you. Just this morning we had another conversation with some students, and there was one particular student who shared that she had faced, or that she had felt like she couldn't really speak out in one of her classes because she was afraid that her professor, who had a different viewpoint, might come down on her grade. And we asked, well, would it have made a difference if your professor had said, look, this is not going to affect your grade. And she said, yeah, that I think that would have made a difference. So I think that's part of it, right? Is creating this culture within the classroom that says, like, this is what this classroom is for. This classroom is for difficult conversations. We're not going to agree with each other, and that's good. You know, those conversations are going to get you a good grade, not a bad grade. And then it's also, like I said, educating students on how to sit in that discomfort of disagreeing with someone who does have some power over them, right? There's a little bit of a power dynamic there, and teaching them that their voice is just as important as that faculty voice. And that doesn't mean that they can come into, I don't know, a class about women in literature and say, okay, today I really want to talk about Edgar Allan Poe. You know, that it doesn't mean that students get to come and drive the curriculum, because, like you said, academic freedom is really important, and it's a cornerstone part of expressive freedoms on campus. But it does mean that, okay, you know, maybe you can come in and say, you know, I don't really buy this feminism thing in this poem here in the women in literature class. So it's creating a culture, I think, within the classroom that, you know, within the confines of the topic, that there's a little bit more room for debate.
I'm going to try to be fast. I'm going to try to be fast with this answer, but, you know, I'm, you know, not known for that. You know, I hear a lot from folks in legislatures and, you know, out there interacting with students, where they tell me that you know, they're afraid that their teacher's going to, you know, retaliate against them for disagreeing, and it's usually, more often than not, it's a conservative student who has that point of view. You know, and one of the things is that, you know, everyone thinks that they wrote an A+ paper, and sometimes they just didn't. So these are difficult things to parse, and faculty really do need a lot of support in terms of the academic freedom and deferment to their judgments. In many instances, they need, you know, a certain amount of room there. But it's probably a mistake for them not to be introspective, and I'm not saying they're not already, but thinking about what things they could do earlier. Because that example that we heard this morning was from a student who said, I wish I was told up front explicitly that I have the freedom to disagree. And that's different from, like, saying, you know, it's tough because there are right and wrong answers. You know, 2 + 2 in base 10 is 4. You know, that's fact. And, you know, and you're not entitled to your own facts, but you can draw different conclusions from them. And faculty should start exploring, you know, ways that they can you need to be able to communicate that you understand my point of view, but then you could say, I understand your arguments as X, Y, and Z, I understand in these, but I also think here's why I think it's wrong, isn't going to be graded, you know, differently if you really do put in a robust and thoughtful, you know, answer. And that all has to happen on a case-by-case basis. I tell legislators all the time, no, you cannot set up a committee outside of the institution of higher education to regrade papers. Like, which I'm not kidding you. I've heard that idea floated about by multiple lawmakers across the country. So, you know, it's tricky because, you know, because there probably are faculty that don't do a great job of checking their biases. But there are many, 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 many who do. And thinking about it together and discussing it together is, you know, going to help come up with better best practices, I think. That, you know, we're not going to be able to just create as a panel.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. So I think I'm glad that we're being able to kind of talk about these things. I think one thing that came to mind was that the university is kind of like a bubble in some sense, in that we have a lot of like-minded individuals who have very similar thoughts, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I do think that when it comes to having conversations that maybe are tough, I think we have to kind of burst that bubble a little bit, and that can be really uncomfortable. And especially when it comes to like graduate studies. And you were mentioning kind of students being afraid to kind of speak their mind. And I think, you know, if this room kind of personifies that, I think it kind of talks about how we have limited folks that are willing to do that, because I think there is such a culture on universities that kind of fosters the fact that we're not able to talk about things that, you know, our faculty doesn't agree with, or maybe that our fellow colleagues don't agree with. So I think there is kind of an uncomfortableness to it, but I think that should be okay. It's okay to be uncomfortable because I think that's all part of learning. You know, we're going to go to classes that we're not necessarily going to agree with all the content, and that's okay. That's why we're here. But we should also be able to talk about our opinion on that I don't agree with that, and not fear the repercussions from that. So, yeah.
If you can't remember the last time you changed your mind on something, how do you know it's still working? That's not a quote of my own. Alice Drager, said it first, and she was quoting someone who she could not remember who to attribute it to, but acknowledged that it was not of her own creation. But I think the broader point, which I agree with you, sir, for bringing up, is that silos are generally unhealthy, right? So actively trying to reach out of them is a good habit to be in. And again, that doesn't mean engaging in everyone who you disagree with and being like, no, I have a moral or legal obligation to kind of see if I can change their mind, because having a person out there who has this point of view just really rankles me. Of course, you have that right to do that. But as I said before, find the smartest people you can think of, who disagree with you, and try to kind of not straw man their points of views. And this is true no matter which side of the political spectrum you're on. You might change your mind sometimes. You might make your own arguments better. But you'll definitely be better off, and society's better off when we go through that effort.
So just speaking a little bit more to that discomfort, because I said earlier, the discomfort is inherent in what we're talking about here. At FIRE, we have a very diverse staff, politically diverse. We have a lot of hard conversations, as I'm sure you can imagine if you've ever looked at, the type of work we do. We regularly disagree with each other. It's part of our daily ethos to have respectful disagreements, and it's exhausting. And that's in an environment where we have a rule that we always assume good intentions and we stay respectful in those disagreements. I go home and I have my nightly hot chocolate as my at the end of a hard day of thinking through these topics and really critically thinking about them and having these difficult conversations, I have my hot chocolate. And I think I'm not really being silly here. I think that's part of it, is finding your hot chocolate, right? What can you do at the end of your day after sitting in this discomfort, after engaging with people who you don't agree with, finding those really smart people who have arguments that are different than your own, and then what can you do at the end of the day to say, okay, that was a good day, and now I'm gonna chill, And I think that's a really big part of that educational process of learning to live in the discomfort.
So in legal training, obviously the art of advocacy is really what what we're taught in law school. And I was thinking about this in preparation for this event, and I think it'd be a good exercise for everyone in this room. You obviously were exposed to either you watch Fox News or you watch CNN or whatever. Find an area that you're discomfort level and advocate that point. And a point that you might completely disagree with on your own personal basis. Think about it. And could you come up with an argument that you could support it? I think that exercise of the brain, so to speak, can be really beneficial to really help you be able to analyze issues and come to your own opinion, right? I think there's a lot of, with social media and everything else today, there's a lot of just sort of following the leader, without really the critical thinking that you really need to do to enjoy life. Paula.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, you can. I think my audience for this maybe just walked out the door, but I'm thinking about the students and what a fertile ground a university campus is for these kinds of discussions, because it feels like once you leave this, I think somebody referred to it as a bubble, it's hard to do that. Now, I work in higher education. This is the environment I work in. I think Lindsay and Joe, the environment that you work in, where in your workplace you can kind of debate, that really doesn't exist every day in corporate America. So if you're not on a college campus, maybe the place that you get to have those kinds of conversations are maybe online. And those areas are toxic often. And so it's difficult. So being in this environment is such a joy to be able to exercise those rights that you have everywhere and to hone them. You know, as has been said, it's really hard. It's really hard to come up against a different point of view, something that you strongly feel in your heart, and then put your heart out there and describe how you're feeling, knowing that you're going to get strong opposition. And so doing it in this safe place is awesome. So students who are later going to look at this or who are in the room, please lean into that.
Again, agreed. The opportunities that you have while you're students, once you're back in the workforce, full time, and you have, maybe families, and the things that are on your plate just to get through the things you have to do leaves very little time for any even leisure, yet alone the kind of exercise and debate and discussion. But you're right that people still engage in those conversations, whether it's with a family member at the table, or on a phone call, or online, with a stranger, or with a neighbor. I happen to live in a neighborhood where it's almost 50-50 DNR, which is, I know, very unique in the United States. But I love all my neighbors. Like, there are things in which they sometimes will say something politically that make me go, I don't know about that. But it doesn't make me any less happy to have them over for dinner. And I think that it's harder and harder for us to see the humanity in our adversaries. It's easier for us to see people as being encapsulated by their worst point of view that they hold and their worst opinion that they hold. And this is a great opportunity when you're in college, when you're meeting people and making and forging friendships, to deprogram yourself from that way of thinking by seeing it like, hey, I'm from the left, I'm from the right, and I get along with someone from the other side who's like a really great friend who would help me move and pick up, and help me move a couch for a pizza. I mean, that's kind of the point here, which is that it's opportunity, and it's hard because the outside world is still existing, and we're debating things that impact the rights that people will really have, or there are serious consequences. You don't have to set aside your sense of justice to do this. You just have to set aside your sense of self-righteousness to do it, which is different. And because you can be right at the end of the day, and you can fiercely advocate and put everything you can to win on the policy level without removing the humanity. And I see Jeff is giving me a signal.
Well, I'm not giving you a signal, but I want to kind of follow up on that. We had a great conversation earlier with some faculty and staff, and I want to be clear, this conversation has been more about how we can talk across our differences, which is what we talk a lot about on this campus. But at the same time, you made a great point, Joe, that there are times when protesting in the proper way has made a difference in history for underrepresented groups. So can you talk a little bit about the difference between social protest, social justice, and shouting somebody down that you disagree with? Because I think that's a distinction that we need to make in a conversation on a college campus.
What a great conversation, Jeff. And I'll kick us off, and I'll Lindsay tap my shoulder, give some signal if you want to weigh in. However you want to signal to me that you want to jump in, please. One of the primary things that folks in education try to do is foster, the habit of civil discourse. Like, how do you, be more productive in your discourse? I think it's an important and crucial aim, but the law doesn't allow requiring civility, and part of that is because advancements in civil rights have been earned through confrontation, and sometimes with anger in tone, whether it was marching, fist in the air, and that's true of the civil rights movement, that's true of the LGBT movement, that's true of women's suffrage. I pointed out this morning that it's, there's this misconception that that was won over ladies politely discussing the issues over tea, but no, they were angry and they were confrontational and they were showing their ankles to demonstrate that like the status quo just wasn't okay. And so what I would say is it's okay to be confrontational in protest, but the question that the courts look at, and I think it's the right one, is whether or not you're adding your voice or whether or not you're trying to silence the other side. And that's called the heckler's veto in terms of legal terminology, where the courts don't allow for folks to be silenced because they might attract protest. So when an event is happening and someone rushes the stage and grabs the mic or assaults the speaker, or they chant so loudly that the event doesn't go on for half an hour, and we saw what happened, and I won't go into it in great detail, but those of us in this space saw what happened at Stanford Law School with Judge Kyle Duncan of the Fifth Circuit, where he was prevented from speaking. All of those things don't add to a debate where one side can win at the end, or we can come to a better understanding that's, I'm completely right and you're not worth listening to. And and that's really the line that we're trying to get away from. One quick caveat: there is a place for civil disobedience. There's a place for injustices so grave that you're willing to break the law to illustrate your point. Chain yourself to a tree, sit in Keith's office and refuse to leave, because of such and such policy. But the point of that is that we're willing to break the rules and willing to face the consequences because you think it's so important. It's not that there isn't a consequence for it when you break those kind of perfectly reasonable rules. Because to be clear, Keith's office is not a public forum available for protest. It's there for him to get his work done. So there is a place for civil disobedience, and the question on the other side is the punishment proportional to the way that civil disobedience came out? And you see all these things across the world where people are blocking traffic and stopping people from getting to the hospital when they're in labor because of whatever policy they're protesting. You have to make your own personal decision about what laws you're willing to break if you engage in civil disobedience, but, it's disobedience. So, to some, we should be promoting better and civil discourse. We shouldn't be requiring it. People should understand that when they choose a tone that isn't civil, it will affect how their audience views them and how persuasive they are. Because very few people like being told that they're jerks and find that persuasive. I've been told I'm a jerk often. I've never been persuaded by that.
I don't know that I have anything to add on that question.
Well, I think we're at our time, so let's thank our panel.